The Texas sun in 1875 didn't just shine, it punished. It cooked the plains until the heat shimmered off the dirt like a phantom river. Out in that shimmering hell rode a cowboy named Daniel. He was a man accustomed to silence. His ranch was quiet. His cabin was quieter. His heart was the quietest place of all. He hadn't shared a meal with another soul in months. He hadn't heard a real laugh in years. He was a ghost on his own land. That morning he was tracking cattle, but his eyes caught something else. Another trail, bare footprints, small, frantic, stumbling toward a dry creek bed where there was no water, only death. Something tightened in Daniel's chest. Out here, a person alone was a person already gone. He nudged his horse, moving not on a thought, but an instinct. The tracks got wilder, weaving like a drunkard's. Whoever it was, they were at their end. Then he saw her, sprawled under a skeletal mesquite tree, a young Apache woman. Her skin was the color of ash. Her dress was ripped to shreds, her feet bloody from thorns and stone. Each breath she took was a tiny, shallow gasp, as if she was forgetting how to live. She tried to get up when she saw him, but her body wouldn't obey. Her eyes, though. Her eyes burned with a fire that hadn't gone out yet. Fear. Defiance. A cornered animal ready for one last fight. Daniel swung off his horse slow. The crunch of his boots on the baked earth was the only sound. He didn't want to spook her. He pulled his canteen, his movements careful, deliberate. "You're safe," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but he kept it low. He held the water out to her. For a second, she just stared. Suspicion wrestled with thirst. Thirst won. Her hands trembled as she took the canteen. She drank like a woman who had been dragged through the desert for a week, water spilling down her chin, washing away the dust. When she was done, she whispered a name. Nali. It was a faint sound, fragile as a dry leaf, but it was a piece of her, a piece that hadn't been stolen. Daniel looked at her face. It was young, but old with suffering. She couldn't walk another step. He knew it. Without a word, he lifted her. She was light as a bundle of sticks. She didn't fight him. She leaned into his chest, half conscious, and gave him what little trust she had left. He mounted his horse, holding her close. The ride back was long. The desert was an endless, empty canvas. He kept his eyes on the horizon, on the shape of his small, lonely cabin. Her shallow breathing against his shirt was a constant reminder of how close she was to slipping away for good. He didn't know why fate had put her in his path, but he knew he wouldn't let her die. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was a bloody smear on the horizon. He carried her inside, laid her gently on his own bed. He lit a fire, and its warm glow pushed back the shadows in the small room. He put a pot of broth on to simmer. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. As the warmth spread through her, tears started to track clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. She ate in silence, cried in silence. Daniel sat across from her, watching. He knew kindness was a foreign currency in her world. Hell, it was a foreign currency in his. But this wasn't pity. It felt like purpose. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But he had no idea that by bringing her here, he hadn't just saved a life. He had just started a war. The days that followed were quiet. Nali started to heal. Her body mended, but her spirit was still a wounded thing. She didn't talk much. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than a scream. She moved through his small cabin like a phantom, stitching his torn clothes with hands that were surprisingly steady. She tended the small patch of garden he'd nearly let die, coaxing life back into the soil. Sometimes when she thought he wasn't listening, she would hum these soft, sad songs in her own language. His cabin had only ever known the sound of wind and groaning timber. Now it had music, it had life. He didn't push her. He didn't ask about the fresh scars on her arms or the terror that sometimes flared in her eyes. He just gave her space, gave her food, gave her safety. He gave her time, and slowly something started to grow between them. It was as fragile as a desert flower, but it was there. Trust. One evening they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in angry streaks of orange and purple. She was looking out at the horizon, at the endless plains that had almost swallowed her whole. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, flat. She told him about raiders, about fire and screaming, about her village being scattered to the wind. She had run. She had run until her feet were raw and her lungs burned, hunted by nothing but fear. Her people were gone. Her world was gone. She had nothing, no one. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. She was confessing that she had nowhere left to belong in the entire world. Daniel listened. He sat there like a stone statue, his weathered face unreadable. When she was finished, when the whole ugly story hung in the air between them, he reached across the small wooden table. He covered her trembling hand with his own. "Then you're not alone anymore," he said. The words weren't a promise. They were a vow. Something changed in her eyes then, a flicker of light in the darkness. From that night on, the silence between them was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable. He started teaching her to ride his big chestnut horse. At first she was nervous, her hands gripping the saddle horn until her knuckles were white. But soon he heard something he never thought he'd hear. Her laugh, clear and bright, cutting through the heavy air. That sound did something to his heart he didn't understand. She started teaching him things too, words in her language. She taught him the word for protector, Nantan. She started calling him that. But the world outside their little patch of land wasn't so kind. Word gets around in a place like this. Whispers started in the settlement a few miles away. The lonely rancher, Daniel, had an Apache woman living with him. The whispers turned to warnings. His neighbors told him he was a fool, that she was dangerous, a savage. Daniel's jaw just set harder. They didn't know her. They didn't see the way she gently tended a wounded bird she found, or the quiet dignity in her eyes. He wasn't going to bend. The tension kept growing, coiling like a snake, until one afternoon in town, a big-mouthed rancher named Silas decided to say his piece to Daniel's face. He mocked him. He called Nali filthy names. The words were sharp. They were meant to cut. Daniel's hand curled into a fist. The next thing Silas knew, he was tasting dust. Daniel hadn't said a word. He just laid him out flat in the middle of the street. Silence fell over the town. The jeers died in their throats. The message was clear. Daniel, the quiet man, stood with her, and he would stand over anyone who tried to harm her. When they got back to the ranch that night, Nali sat by the fire just watching him. Her eyes were glistening. He hadn't just defended her. He had given her back a piece of her honor. He wasn't just her rescuer anymore. He was her protector. But as she looked at him, a new cold fear began to creep in. This man was good. This man was strong. And she was going to get him killed, because she hadn't told him the whole story. The men who attacked her village weren't just raiders. They were hunters. And she was the one they were hunting. That night, the sky broke open. A storm rolled in off the plains, a monster of black clouds and screaming wind. Thunder cracked so loud the little cabin shook. Rain hammered the roof like a drumbeat of war. Lightning bleached the world white for a heartbeat, then plunged it back into darkness. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside Nali. The sound of the thunder was the sound of rifle fire. The flash of the lightning was the flash of burning homes. The memories came back, not as whispers, but as screams. She was back in the fire, back in the terror. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her whole body. Tears streamed down her face. She couldn't breathe. Then Daniel was there. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest. He was solid, an anchor in the chaos. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair, his voice steady and calm. "I've got you. You're safe." She clung to him. She buried her face in his shirt, trying to block out the ghosts. He was the only thing that was real, the only thing that wasn't trying to kill her. And in that moment of pure terror, clinging to the only solid thing in her universe, a word escaped her lips. It was a whisper, trembling and fragile. "Husband." The word hung in the air between them, more powerful than the thunder. Daniel went still. The whole world stopped. His heart, the heart he thought had turned to stone years ago, clenched so tight it hurt. He held her closer, a realization washing over him like a flood. He had found more than just a companion to fill the silence. He had found a reason. He had found love. Not the kind you read about in books. This was a wilder thing. A love born from survival, forged in fire, strengthened by the storm. It wasn't sealed with a ceremony or a ring. It was sealed with a single word, whispered in the dark, while the world tried to tear itself apart outside. That night, they lay side by side as the storm raged. They weren't a lonely cowboy and a lost Apache woman anymore. They were two halves of a whole, and from that day on, she called him husband. He called her wife. The world could whisper all it wanted. They had each other. They started to build a life. Not just a ranch, but a home. A sanctuary. His strength and her gentleness fit together like pieces of a puzzle. They were finally whole. But a storm was coming for them. A storm of men and guns. The men who had destroyed her village were still out there. And they weren't just going to let the only witness to their crimes disappear. They were coming, and they would burn down the whole world to find her. What Daniel didn't know was that they weren't just coming for Nali. They were coming for him too. He just didn't know it yet. The rhythm of their lives changed. It found a new steady beat. Daniel would rise before the sun, his hands sure and strong as he worked the ranch. Nali would bring the cabin to life, her quiet songs filling the rooms that had once been tombs of silence. She softened him, taught him a patience he never knew he had. His steadfastness anchored her, giving her a rock to cling to while the ghosts of her past slowly faded. They were a strange sight, the scarred cowboy and his Apache wife. But they were happy. One morning, Daniel was up on a fence post, mending a rail that had split. The wood was old, damp from a morning dew. His boot slipped. He came down hard. The crack of the bone was a sickening, sharp sound that cut through the morning air. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up his leg. He was bound to his bed for weeks, helpless. He felt weak, useless. But Nali wasn't weak. The woman he had carried out of the desert, the frail girl on the edge of death, was gone. In her place was a warrior. She nursed him, her touch gentle. But then she went out into the scorching sun and did his work. She fed the cattle. She hauled water from the well. She chopped wood. Her small frame strained with the effort, but she never stopped. She would work all day, then come inside and put a cool cloth on his forehead, humming one of her soft songs. Watching her, Daniel saw it clearly. She wasn't his ward. She wasn't a burden. She was his equal. She was his wife. That night, as the fire crackled, he called her over to the bed. He'd been working on something for days, whittling away with his knife. He pressed a small silver band into her hand. He'd carved it himself from an old coin. He took her hand and slid it onto her finger. His voice was thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "No preacher," he said, his voice cracking. "No paper. You're my wife. Always." Her eyes filled with tears. But these were not tears of sorrow. She leaned down and whispered her vow back to him in her own tongue. Their marriage wasn't sealed by law or God. It was sealed by firelight and hardship. It was carved into their hearts. But their simple life was a fragile thing, a bubble, and it was about to burst. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a neighbor. This man rode tall and straight in the saddle. He wore a duster, even in the heat. And the rifle in his scabbard wasn't a hunting rifle. It was a military Sharps. Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He'd seen men like that before. The rider stopped his horse 100 yards from the cabin. He didn't get down. He just sat there, watching. Nali saw him too. The color drained from her face. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. But it wasn't fear in her eyes. It was something else. Recognition. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we have to run." But it was too late. The man raised his rifle, not to aim it, but as a signal. And from the ridges on either side of the ranch, more riders appeared. A dozen of them. They had been there the whole time, hidden, waiting. They had been surrounded. The man in the duster trotted his horse forward. He stopped just out of pistol range. His face was weathered, with a nasty scar that cut through one eyebrow. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Daniel!" he yelled. "My name's Miller. We don't want you. We just want the girl." Daniel moved to the doorway, his own rifle in his hands. He kept his body in front of Nali. "She's not going anywhere." Miller laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't be a fool. You don't know who you're protecting. She's a thief. and a liar. "Get off my land," Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your land?" Miller sneered. "This land belongs to Major Thorne now, and he wants his property back. The girl and the ledger she stole." The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. Major Thorne, a ghost from his past, a man he'd served under in the war, a butcher, a man he thought was long dead. He looked back at Nali. Her face was a mask of terror. She hadn't just been running from raiders. She'd been running from him, from Thorne. Suddenly, things started to click into place. The attack on her village wasn't random. It was an extermination. They were silencing witnesses. And Nali wasn't just a survivor. She was the only one who got out, the only one who could tell the world what Thorne had done. And she had the proof, a ledger. "Last chance, Daniel," Miller shouted. "Give her up, or we burn you out." Daniel looked at the men surrounding his home. He looked at the woman behind him, the woman he called wife. There was no choice. There never was. He raised his rifle. "You'll have to come and get her." Miller's cold smile widened. "Have it your way." He raised his hand and dropped it, and all hell broke loose. The first volley of shots tore through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. Splinters flew like shrapnel. Nali screamed and Daniel pulled her down to the floor. "Stay down!" he yelled over the roar of the guns. He crawled to the window, peeked over the sill. Miller's men were advancing, using the cattle pens and the water trough for cover. They were professionals, not some drunken posse. Daniel sighted down his rifle, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. One of the men screamed and went down, clutching his leg. This wasn't a fight he could win. There were too many of them, but he could make them pay for every inch. "The back window!" Nali yelled, her voice sharp with urgency. "We can get to the creek bed." He risked a glance. She was right. The back of the cabin faced a steep drop-off into the dry creek. If they could make it, they might have a chance. Another volley of shots ripped through the house. The oil lamp on the table shattered, splashing oil everywhere. "Nali, get ready to run," he shouted. He laid down covering fire, firing as fast as he could lever the rounds. Two more men went down. They were faltering, surprised by the stiff resistance. Then he saw it. One of Miller's men, sneaking around the side of the house, with a torch. "They're firing the house," he screamed. The whoosh of the flames catching was terrifyingly fast. The dry timber of the cabin went up like a tinderbox. Smoke started to fill the room, thick and black. It choked him, blinded him. He grabbed Nali's arm. "Now, go!" They scrambled for the back window. Daniel kicked out the frame and pushed her through. He was about to follow when a piece of the burning roof collapsed, blocking his path. He was trapped. "Daniel!" Nali screamed from outside. He could hear the fire roaring, feel the heat searing his skin. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see, couldn't breathe. He was going to die here, in this little cabin that had finally become a home. Then he heard her voice again, closer this time. Not a scream of fear, but a command. "The floor!" she yelled. "The loose board!" The floor? He dropped to his belly, crawling away from the flames, his hands slapping against the rough planks. He found it, a single board that was slightly raised. He remembered his father telling him about it years ago, a secret from the old days. He hooked his fingers under it and pulled. It came up, revealing a black, gaping hole, a root cellar. He didn't hesitate. He dropped into the darkness just as the rest of the roof caved in with a deafening roar. He lay there in the cool, damp earth, listening to the fire rage above him. He was alive, but he had no idea what he had just crawled into. The cellar wasn't just a cellar. It was a tunnel, an escape road his father had built, leading to an old dry well 50 yards from the cabin. He crawled through the darkness, the sounds of shouting and gunfire fading as he went deeper. He could hear Nali up ahead, her movements sure and steady. They emerged from the well into the twilight, covered in dirt and smelling of smoke. They were hidden by a thicket of brush. They looked back at their home. It was an inferno. Miller and his men were circling it, their faces lit by the flames. Then another rider approached. Daniel's blood ran cold. It was the town sheriff, Sheriff Bellows. He wasn't there to help. He rode right up to Miller and held out his hand. Miller dropped a heavy pouch of coins into it. The law was bought. There was no one to turn to. No one was coming to save them. Nali pulled at his sleeve. "We have to go, now." They slipped away into the darkness, leaving the ashes of their life behind them. They had nothing. No food, no water, only one horse between them, and the ledger which Nali had tucked into her dress. They ran all night. As the sun began to rise, they found a small cave to hide in. Daniel slumped against the rock wall, exhausted. He had a nasty burn on his arm from the fire. Nali immediately set to work. She gathered herbs he didn't recognize, chewed them into a poultice, and gently applied it to the wound. The relief was immediate. He watched her, her face serious with concentration. "How did you know about the floorboard?" he asked. She looked up, and for the first time he saw a flicker of a smile. "You talk in your sleep." He stared at her. "What else do I say?" "You mostly mumble about fences," she said, her smile widening just a little. It was the first moment of peace they'd had, but it didn't last. He looked at the poultice on his arm. The smell was familiar, soothing. It stirred a memory from deep in his childhood. A memory he had buried long ago. His mother. She wasn't spoken of. His father had forbidden it, but he remembered her. He remembered her gentle hands and the strange-smelling medicines she would make for his scrapes and bruises. She had been Cherokee. He looked at Nali, truly looked at her. "Where did you learn to make this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Her hands stilled. She looked away, toward the mouth of the cave. "My grandmother taught me." She paused. "She was not Apache. She was taken in by my people as a child. She was Cherokee." The world shifted on its axis. This woman who had stumbled into his life out of the desert. This woman he had come to love. They were connected by a thread he never could have imagined. A thread of blood and memory stretching back through the years. He didn't know what to say. He just reached out and took her hand. They sat there in silence as the sun rose higher. Two lost souls from different worlds, bound together by a shared history they were only just beginning to understand. But Thorn was still out there. He wouldn't stop. He had the law in his pocket and a small army of killers at his command. He would hunt them to the ends of the earth for that ledger. Their only hope was to get to Fort Griffin, to find an officer who wasn't on Thorne's payroll. It was 100 miles of open country, and they would be hunted every step of the way. They traveled by night, hiding during the day. The land was their enemy. Every shadow could be one of Miller's men. Every sound was a threat. The days were a blur of heat and thirst. The nights were a freezing hell. They shared the horse, taking turns riding and walking. They shared the last of their food. They shared their fears. The hardship stripped them down to their cores. There were no secrets left between them. He told her about the war, about the things he'd seen under Thorne's command, the casual cruelty that had made him walk away from the army and seek a life of solitude. She told him about the ledger. Her father had been a scout for the army, respected and trusted. He had discovered that Thorne was not just stealing supplies. He was selling army rifles to renegade war parties, arming them, then using their raids as an excuse to demand more troops, more funding, more power. He was manufacturing a war for his own profit. Her father had documented all. Every transaction, every date, every name. He was going to expose him. But Thorne found out. The raid on their village wasn't a raid. It was an assassination. And they killed everyone, just to be sure. Nali only survived because she had been out gathering herbs. She came back to find her world in flames. She found her father dying. He pushed the ledger into her hands and told her to run. And she had been running ever since. "He will never stop," she whispered one night, huddled by a tiny smokeless fire. "As long as this book exists, we are dead." "Then we make sure it gets into the right hands," Daniel said, his jaw set. "We get to Fort Griffin. We find an honest man. We end this." But Fort Griffin was a lifetime away. A few days later, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The air grew heavy and still. The same kind of storm that had brought them together was coming again. But this time, they were out in the open. Nowhere to hide. The rain came suddenly, a solid wall of water that soaked them in seconds. The wind shrieked. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder. Their horse panicked and bolted, disappearing into the deluge. They were alone, on foot, in the middle of the plains. They clung to each other, trying to stay upright against the force of the wind. We're not going to make it, Nali cried, her words ripped away by the gale. Yes, we are, Daniel shouted back, pulling her closer. We are. In that moment, huddled together in the heart of the storm, with death all around them, the world fell away. There was no Thorn, no Miller, no past, no future. There was only this, only them. He looked down at her face illuminated by a flash of lightning, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his soul that he would rather die here with her than live 1,000 years alone. It was here in the midst of chaos that they truly became husband and wife. A vow made not with words but with a desperate, clinging embrace. A promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The storm that was meant to kill them, saved them. The torrential rain washed away their tracks. When the sky finally cleared, the world was fresh and clean. And the storm had revealed something. The rain had carved a new channel in the side of a small mesa, exposing a trail that had been hidden by rock and sand. It was a faint path, barely visible, a trail that no white man would ever notice. Nali saw it. Her eyes went wide. I know this place, she whispered, her voice filled with a strange mix of hope and fear. My people. They spoke of a hidden place, a place of refuge. She pointed to the trail. It leads there, I think. I think I know the way. It was a long shot, a ghost of a chance, but it was the only one they had. She led him up the treacherous path, her footing sure and certain. It was a path she knew not with her eyes but with her blood. The trail wound deep into the mesas, a maze of stone and shadow where no posse would ever dare to follow. After hours of climbing, they came to a narrow crack in a sheer rock wall, almost completely hidden by overgrown brush. Here, she said, her voice trembling. They squeezed through the opening, and what they saw on the other side made them stop dead. It was a canyon, a green jewel hidden in the heart of the barren rock. A stream flowed through the center, and small, well-tended fields of corn and squash grew on its banks. Tucked under the overhanging cliffs were dozens of wickiups. Smoke rose from cook fires. Children were laughing and playing by the stream. It was a village, alive. An old woman looked up from her work and saw them. Her eyes widened. She dropped the basket she was weaving and let out a cry. Nali! People came running from all directions. They surrounded her, touching her, crying her name. They had thought she was dead. She was a ghost returned to them. She was home. The survivors of her people had found their way here, to this secret place. Her mother was here, her brother. Daniel stood back watching the reunion. He was an outsider here, a stranger. A tall, fierce-looking warrior with eyes as hard as obsidian stepped forward. He looked Daniel up and down with open hostility. This was her brother, Kyle. Who is this white man? He demanded, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. Nali stepped between them. He is my husband, she said, her voice clear and strong. A stunned silence fell over the canyon. Kyle stared at Daniel, his eyes burning with suspicion and hatred. He cannot be trusted. He is one of them. He saved my life, Nali insisted. He fought for me. Our home was burned because of me. But Kyle would not be swayed. The prejudice of the outside world existed here too. A mirror image. Then an old man, the village elder, stepped forward. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He listened as Nali told her story. All of it. About Thorn, the ledger, the chase. When she was finished, the elder looked at Daniel for a long, silent moment. Thorn, the old man said, his voice a low rumble. We know this name. He is the snake in the grass who makes the tribes fight each other. He is the one who sells the fire sticks that kill our children. He turned to his people. There is a prophecy, he said, his voice rising. It says that when our people are scattered and our hope is lost, a warrior will come, a man of two worlds. He will help us reclaim what was stolen. He looked directly at Daniel. Perhaps this is that man, Kyle scoffed. He is a cowboy, not a warrior. He must be tested. The elder nodded slowly. He must be tested. And so it was decided. Daniel would face a trial to prove his worth, a horse race through the treacherous, winding canyons, a race against Kyle, the best rider in the tribe. If he won, he would be accepted. If he lost, he would be cast out, and Nali would have to choose between her husband and her people. The stakes had never been higher. The fate of their future rested on the outcome of a single, desperate race. The morning of the race dawned clear and cold. The entire village gathered at the mouth of the canyon. Kel was mounted on a fiery paint pony, a horse born and bred in these canyons. It moved like a living part of the rock. Daniel was given a tough, wiry Mustang. It had a wild look in its eye. Nali came to him as he was tightening the cinch. She pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. "For luck," she whispered. Her eyes were full of fear, but also a fierce pride. The elder explained the rules. They would race to the top of the highest mesa, retrieve a single eagle feather from a staff planted there, and return. There were no other rules. Kel gave Daniel a look of pure contempt. "Try to keep up, white man," he sneered. And with a whoop he was gone, his pony scrambling up the canyon wall like a goat. Daniel dug his heels into the Mustang's sides. The horse leaped forward, and the race was on. It was immediately clear he was outmatched. Cal knew every twist, every turn, every hidden path. Daniel was a plains rider. This was like trying to ride on the moon. He pushed his horse, taking risks, cutting corners, but Cal stayed ahead of him. As they climbed higher, the canyon narrowed. They were racing along a precipice, a sheer drop of 1,000 feet on one side. Cal was a blur ahead of him. Daniel was losing. He had to do something desperate. He saw a game trail, a path even more treacherous, but it cut straight up the side of the mesa. It was a shortcut. It was also suicide. He didn't hesitate. He veered off the main trail, urging the Mustang up the sheer rock face. The horse slipped, its hooves scrabbling for purchase. For a terrifying second, they were sliding backward toward the edge. But the Mustang found its footing. It lunged upward, and they were back on solid ground. He had gained on Cale. They were neck and neck. They burst onto the top of the mesa at the same time. The eagle feather whipped in the wind. They both reached for it, their hands closing on it together. And then they heard it. A gunshot. It echoed up from the canyon below. They both froze, their rivalry forgotten. They looked down, and their blood ran cold. A group of riders was entering the hidden canyon. Miller and his men. They had found the village. Somehow they had been followed. Another shot rang out, then another. Screams drifted up on the wind. Cale let out a roar of fury. He turned his pony and plunged back down the trail he had just climbed. Daniel was right behind him. The race was over. A war had just begun. They weren't rivals anymore. They were brothers fighting for the same thing, for their family, for their home. They galloped down the trail, a single desperate thought in both their minds. They had led the wolves right to the sheep. They burst back into the canyon to a scene of chaos. Miller's men were firing into the village, their bullets ripping through the wickiups. The Apache warriors were fighting back with bows and old hunting rifles, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. "They have Nali!" An old woman shrieked, pointing toward the stream. Daniel saw her. Miller had her by the arm, dragging her toward his horse. He was after the ledger. A blind rage filled Daniel. He let out a yell and charged. His Mustang slammed into Miller's horse, sending both men tumbling to the ground. Daniel was on his feet in an instant. He and Miller circled each other, knives in their hands. The battle raged around them, but for them, the world had shrunk to this single deadly dance. Miller lunged. Daniel sidestepped, the blade whispering past his ear. He countered, his own knife slashing Miller's arm. Meanwhile, Cale had organized the warriors. He was a born leader. He sent half his men scrambling up the canyon walls, raining arrows down on the invaders from above. Nali wasn't a damsel in distress. She grabbed a fallen rifle. She didn't know how to shoot, but she used it as a club, bringing it down hard on the head of one of the men who was trying to flank Cale. The tide was turning. Miller's men were caught in a crossfire. They started to fall back, running for the canyon entrance. Miller saw it was a lost cause. He cursed, turned, and ran for his horse. Daniel tackled him, bringing him down in the dirt. They rolled over and over, punching, kicking, gouging. Daniel was stronger. He got on top of Miller, his hands closing around his throat. "Where is Thorn?" he roared, his face inches from Miller's. Miller just laughed, a bloody gurgling sound. "He's not coming for you, cowboy. You're coming to him." Before Daniel could ask what he meant, an arrow sprouted from Miller's chest. Cale stood over them, his bow still raised. Justice had been served. The battle was over. The surviving raiders had fled. The canyon was quiet except for the cries of the wounded. They had won. They had protected their home. But Miller's last words echoed in Daniel's mind. "You're coming to him." It wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Thorne wouldn't send another posse. Next time he would come himself, and he would bring the army with him. They couldn't wait for him to come to them. They had to take the fight to him. That night a council was held. They made a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan. They would use the ledger as bait. They would send a message to Thorne from a captured Nali, a trade, the book for her life. The meeting would be at a place of their choosing, a narrow box canyon, a day's ride from the fort, a place where the terrain was their ally, a place where they could set a trap. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only chance. Before they left, as the moon climbed high over the canyon, Daniel found Nali by the stream. He didn't have a silver coin this time. He had taken a piece of wood and carved a simple, smooth ring. He slipped it onto her finger. "I wish I could give you more," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She placed her hand on his cheek. "You have given me everything," she whispered, "my husband." They stood there for a long time, two people from different worlds, bound by a love that was stronger than any army. They were facing a battle they would probably not survive, but they were together. A scout returned just before dawn. His face was grim. "Thorne took the bait," he said. "He's coming." He paused. "He's not coming alone. He's bringing his entire company." Daniel looked at Kyle. Kyle looked back, his face a grim mask. They had a dozen warriors with old rifles and bows. Thorne was coming with 100 cavalry soldiers, armed with the best weapons the army had to offer. The trap was set, but it felt like they were the ones about to be crushed. The box canyon was a tomb waiting for a body. The rock walls rose 100 feet straight up on three sides, leaving only one way in and one way out. Cale placed his warriors on the ridges, hidden among the rocks. They were nearly invisible. Daniel and a handful of the best riders hid their horses in a small alcove near the back of the canyon. Nali stood alone in the center of the canyon floor. The ledger was in a leather pouch at her feet. She was the bait. Daniel watched her from his hiding place, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. She looked so small, so alone, but there was no fear in her eyes, only determination. Hours passed. The sun beat down, turning the canyon into an oven. Then they heard it, the jingle of harnesses, the tramp of many horses. Thorne's company rode into the canyon. They moved with a swagger, confident, arrogant. Major Thorne was at their head, a big, barrel-chested man with a cruel mouth. Beside him rode Sheriff Bellows, looking nervous. Thorne reined in his horse, a smirk on his face as he looked at Nali. "Well, well," he boomed, "the little prairie mouse. I have to admit, you've caused me more trouble than I expected. Now give me my book." Nali didn't move. "Let my people go," she said, her voice ringing with a strength Daniel had never heard before. "Promise you will leave them in peace." Thorne laughed, a nasty, ugly sound. "I don't make promises to savages." He drew his pistol. "The book, now." That was the signal. Daniel let out a war cry. From the ridges above, a volley of arrows rained down. Horses screamed and reared. Soldiers yelled in surprise and pain. Daniel and his riders burst from their hiding place, charging straight into the heart of the cavalry company. The surprise was total. The soldiers were packed too tightly in the narrow canyon to maneuver. They were a perfect target. It was chaos. Gun smoke filled the air. The screams of men and horses echoed off the canyon walls. Daniel fought with a cold, clear fury. He wasn't a rancher anymore. He was the soldier he had once been. But this time, he was fighting for a reason. He fought his way through the melee, his eyes locked on one man. Thorne. The major was rallying his men, a brutal, efficient killer. He saw Daniel coming, and a look of recognition, then hatred, crossed his face. "You!" Thorne roared. "The deserter! I should have had you shot when I had the chance." They met in a clash of steel and fury. While they fought, Sheriff Bellows saw his chance. He spurred his horse toward Nali, trying to grab the ledger. But Nali was ready. She ducked under his grasping hand, came up with a rock, and smashed it against his knee. He howled in pain. Before he could recover, Cale was there. He dragged the sheriff from his horse and put a knife to his throat. The battle was turning. Thorne's men were trapped, dying. Thorne knew it. He let out a roar of frustration and spurred his horse, trying to break through the ring of warriors and escape the canyon. Daniel cut him off. He launched himself from his own saddle, tackling Thorne and bringing them both crashing to the ground. The world exploded into a whirlwind of fists and dust. Thorne was bigger, heavier, but Daniel was faster, fueled by a righteous fire. "You took everything from her," Daniel screamed, landing a solid punch on Thorne's jaw. Thorne spat blood. "She was nothing. Her people were nothing. Just obstacles to progress." He lunged, a hidden knife appearing in his hand. The blade sliced Daniel's side, but he barely felt it. He twisted, grabbing Thorne's wrist, forcing the knife away. "You know," Thorne grunted, his face contorted with effort. "I knew your father, a real idealist, always talking about honor. He asked too many questions, just like you." The implication was clear. His father's death, a supposed riding accident, hadn't been an accident at all. Thorne had been a shadow over his entire life, a poison that had tainted everything. The rage in Daniel became a white-hot nova. He put all his strength into one final effort, twisting the knife from Thorne's hand and sending it flying. He slammed his fist into Thorne's face again and again until the major went limp beneath him. He had won. Panting, bleeding, Daniel stood up. He looked at the man who had caused so much pain. He could end it. Right here. Right now. But he didn't. Killing him would be too easy. It would be an escape. Thorne deserved justice, not vengeance. And that's when they heard it. The sound of a bugle. At the entrance to the canyon, a column of blue-coated cavalry appeared. But these weren't Thorne's men. They were uniformed, disciplined. They were led by a gray-haired colonel with an honest face. They rode into the canyon, their faces grim as they took in the scene of carnage. The colonel dismounted. He looked at Thorne, then at the ledger that Cale handed him. He had received an anonymous tip, he said. A message from the Apache elders, sent days ago. A message about a rogue officer and a stolen book of secrets. The jig was up. The colonel looked at Daniel, then at Nali. "It seems the army owes you a debt of gratitude." Thorne and his surviving men, including Sheriff Bellows, were arrested. The ledger was the final nail in their coffins. They would be court-martialed, tried, and hanged. Justice, real justice, had finally come to the frontier. The colonel offered Daniel a full pardon for his desertion. He offered him a commission, a chance to be a hero. Daniel looked at Nali, standing beside him, her hand in his. He looked at Cale and the Apache warriors, his brothers in arms. He thought of his burned-down cabin, of the quiet life he had built. He shook his head. "Thank you, Colonel," he said, "but I'm already home." They returned to the ranch. It was nothing but ashes, but the land was still there. The sky was still there, and they were still there. They weren't alone. Kyle and his people came with them. They helped them rebuild. The wood of the new cabin was raised by the hands of both Cowboy and Apache. The neighbors who had once whispered and sneered heard the stories. They heard about the battle in the canyon, about the fall of Major Thorne. They saw the Apache helping Daniel rebuild, and their suspicions slowly turned to respect. Then to awe. Years passed. The new cabin stood strong, a testament to resilience. It wasn't a lonely place anymore. It was a bridge between two worlds. Laughter echoed in its walls. The children of Daniel and Nali, with his blue eyes and her black hair, played in the yard with the children of the settlers and the children of the Apache. The lonely cowboy and the lost Apache woman became a legend, a story told around campfires, a story of how a single act of kindness could change the world, a story of how love could bloom in the harshest of lands, and how two people, against all odds, could build a sanctuary, not just for themselves, but for everyone. They grew old together, their hands wrinkled, their hair turned to silver. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky. His hand would find hers, and he would whisper the same thing he whispered every night. The best trail I ever rode, he'd say, was the one that led to you. Their love was a quiet defiance against a world of hatred and prejudice, a living truth that compassion is stronger than cruelty. He had rescued her from the desert, and she had rescued him from a life of emptiness. She had given him the one title he never expected, the one he cherished above all others. Husband. If you enjoyed this story of courage, survival, and a love that conquered all, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Hear from